The police brought my wife home at 3:17 in the morning. She was wearing one slipper, a man's coat, and nothing underneath her nightdress. I was standing at the front door, with my walking frame, when the police car stopped outside. One officer came toward me. The other was helping my wife out of the back seat. She looked at me and smiled. Then she said, "I've been looking for you." I started crying, not because she'd been found, because I knew exactly what the social worker was going to say in the morning. This can't happen again. And she was right. It couldn't. But what she didn't understand was this. My wife wasn't trying to leave me. She was trying to find me. My name is David. I'm 64 years old. I've been married to my wife, Margaret, for 41 years. We never had children. Not because we didn't want them. Life simply never worked out that way. For years it was just the two of us. We were enough for each other. Margaret worked in a primary school. She loved children. She remembered every birthday, every anniversary, every little detail. She could walk into a room she'd never seen before and, 5 minutes later, know everyone's name. She was the person who remembered where I'd left my glasses, the person who knew when I'd taken my medication, the person who could tell from the way I closed a cupboard door whether I was having a bad day. And then, slowly, she started forgetting things. At first we laughed about it. She'd put the milk in the cupboard. I'd find her keys in the fridge. She'd walk into a room and forget why she'd gone there. Normal things, we thought. Everyone gets older. Then one afternoon she called me by her brother's name. Her brother had been dead for 22 years. I remember looking at her. She looked confused. Then she laughed. I laughed too. But that night I didn't sleep. The diagnosis came 18 months later. Dementia. I don't remember much of what the doctor said after that. I remember Margaret squeezing my hand. I remember the word progressive. And I remember asking, "How long?" The doctor looked at me, then said, "There's no reliable way to predict that." That was the beginning of the longest goodbye of my life. I didn't see myself as a carer. I was her husband. There was a difference in my mind. I cooked. I cleaned. I helped her shower. I laid out her clothes. I made sure she ate. I took her to appointments. I put labels on cupboards. I wrote notes everywhere. Kettle, fridge, bathroom, David's medicine. Eventually I put my own name on a card beside the bed. Not because she couldn't remember me every day, because sometimes she couldn't remember me for 10 minutes, then 5, then 2. I started living inside those 2-minute windows. My own health wasn't brilliant. I have arthritis in both knees and a spinal problem that makes walking difficult. I use a walking frame around the house. Outside I use a mobility scooter when I can. People sometimes ask me, "How are you managing?" I always said, "We manage." That was my answer. We manage. Because admitting that we weren't managing felt like admitting I couldn't look after my wife. And I wasn't ready to do that. It happened on a Tuesday. I woke up at 4:50 in the morning. Margaret wasn't beside me. I assumed she'd gone to the toilet. Then I noticed the front door was open. I couldn't run. That is something people don't understand about mobility problems. When you're frightened, your body doesn't suddenly become capable. I grabbed my frame. I went outside. I called her name. Nothing. I called the police. 47 minutes later, they found her. She was at a bus station nearly 2 miles away. She was sitting on a bench. Calm. Perfectly calm. The officer asked, "Where were you going?" Margaret said, "Home." He told her, "You are home." She looked at him, then said, "No, David isn't here." A few days later, a social worker came to see us. Her name was Karen. She was kind. That almost made it worse. If she'd been cold or arrogant, I could have hated her. But she wasn't. She sat at our kitchen table and explained what could happen if Margaret wandered again. False traffic, exposure, getting lost. being unable to tell anyone where she lived. She said, "You can't safely manage this alone anymore." I said, "I'm not alone." She looked at Margaret, then at me. I knew what she meant. 3 weeks later, someone found Margaret walking along a main road. It was 1:30 in the morning. She was wearing her nightdress, barefoot. A stranger had called the police. They brought her home. Karen came the next morning. This time she didn't sit down. She stood in the hallway. She looked at me, then said, "David, we need to talk seriously about residential care." I said, "No." She replied, "You cannot simply say no." I said, "She stays here." Karen's voice softened. "You love her." I said, "More than anything." She said, "Then you have to love her enough to keep her safe." I hated that sentence, because I knew she was right. The third time was worse. Margaret disappeared in the middle of the afternoon. I searched the house, the garden, the street, the local shops. I called the police. 3 hours later, someone found her at a different bus stop. She was trying to get on a bus. She had no coat, no handbag, no idea where she was. When I arrived, she looked at me and said, "You're late." I said, "I'm sorry." She frowned, then asked, "Were you working?" I told her no. I was retired. She had forgotten. That evening, Karen came over. She brought forms, care assessments, emergency contact information, residential care options. I looked at the paperwork. Then I said, "If she goes into a care home, what am I supposed to do?" Karen looked surprised. I continued, "She is all I have." She said, "You can still see her." I said, "That's not what I asked." She sat quietly. I said, "What happens to me when she goes?" That was the first time I'd admitted it. I wasn't only afraid of losing Margaret. I was afraid of becoming nobody. The fourth time changed everything. I woke up to knocking. Police. 3:17 in the morning. Margaret was standing behind them. One slipper. A man's coat. Nightdress underneath. She'd somehow walked nearly 3 miles. They'd found her beside a closed petrol station. She couldn't tell them her address. She couldn't remember my name. But when she saw me, she smiled. "I've been looking for you." I brought her inside. I made tea. I helped her change. I sat beside her until she fell asleep. Then I went into the kitchen, and I broke down, not loudly. I simply sat on the floor beside my walking frame and cried, because I finally understood. Love wasn't enough to keep her safe, and my pride wasn't going to make me stronger. The following week, Karen arranged an assessment. I expected the worst. Instead, she took me to a small residential home. It wasn't what I'd imagined. There were photographs, plants, people sitting together. A woman was singing. Another man was asleep in a chair. It smelled like someone's kitchen, not a hospital. I still hated it, because it wasn't our home. Karen said, "You don't have to decide today." I said, "I think I already have." She looked at me. I said, "I can't do this anymore." That sentence broke something inside me. The night before Margaret was due to move temporarily into the care home, I sat beside her bed. She was awake. I asked, "Do you know who I am?" She looked at me. For a moment I thought she didn't. Then she touched my face. She said, "You're the man who always makes the tea too strong." I laughed. I hadn't heard that sentence in months. I said, "That's me." She smiled. Then she asked, "Are we going home tomorrow?" I couldn't answer. Because we were, and we weren't. The next morning, 2 carers came to help. Margaret was calm. She thought we were going shopping. I packed her clothes, her photographs, her favorite cardigan, the little perfume bottle she'd had for years. I put everything into a suitcase. Then I stood in our bedroom, and I couldn't move. Margaret looked at me. She said, David? I said. Yes? Why are you sad? I told her. Because I love you. She smiled. Then said, I know. The first week nearly destroyed me. The house was silent. No television in the bedroom. No footsteps. No kettle. No Margaret calling from upstairs. David? I kept turning around, expecting her to be there. I'd make 2 cups of tea. Then remember. I'd put 2 plates on the table. Then remember. I'd wake at 2 a.m. and listen for the front door. There was nothing. I thought, this is what being alone feels like. A week later, I visited Margaret. She was sitting in the garden. She looked at me and said, You're late. I laughed. I said, You said that the first time the police found you. She looked confused, then smiled. I sat beside her. We stayed there for an hour. She didn't know what day it was. She didn't know why I was there, but she held my hand. And for that hour, she knew me. Karen called me later that week. She said, Can I tell you something? I said, Yes. She said, Margaret has stopped trying to leave. I was relieved. Then she said, Because we've changed something. I asked what? She said, We asked her why she kept trying to leave the house. I waited. Karen continued. She said she was looking for her husband. I already knew that. But then Karen said something I didn't know. She had asked Margaret, What happens if you don't find him? Margaret had replied, He'll be frightened. I closed my eyes. Karen said, She wasn't running away from you, David. I whispered, I know. She said, She was trying to make sure you weren't alone. A few weeks later, Karen gave me a piece of paper. It was covered in Margaret's handwriting. Most of it made no sense. Words repeated. Sentences stopped halfway through. But one sentence was clear. I'd seen it before. It was something Margaret used to write on birthday cards. It said, Wherever you are, that's where home is. I stared at it, then cried, because I had spent months thinking I was losing my wife. But maybe, even as her memory disappeared, some part of her was still trying to take care of me. I started visiting every day. Not because I had to. Because I wanted to. I helped with her meals. I sat beside her. I took her outside. Sometimes she knew me. Sometimes she didn't. Sometimes she called me by her brother's name. Sometimes she called me Dad. Once she called me the nice man. I laughed about that one. I said, 41 years and that's what I've got? She laughed too. I don't know if she understood the joke, but she laughed. The social worker hadn't taken my wife away. She had helped me admit that I couldn't protect Margaret by myself anymore. I had confused care with doing everything personally. They weren't the same thing. I was still her husband. I could still love her. I could still hold her hand. I could still bring her tea. I could still tell her about our life. I just didn't have to be the entire care system anymore. One evening I visited Margaret just before dinner. She was looking out the window. I sat beside her. She asked, Are we going home? I took her hand. I said, You are home. She looked at me. For a few seconds I thought she understood. Then she smiled. She squeezed my hand and said, Good. I stayed until she fell asleep. Then I walked out slowly with my frame. The corridor was quiet. I reached the front doors. And for the first time since Margaret had moved in, I didn't feel like I was abandoning her. I felt like I was going home to continue loving her. I'm 64 now. Margaret is still living there. Her dementia has progressed. Some days she doesn't know me. Some days she does. But every Sunday I bring her flowers. Every Tuesday, I bring her the same little chocolate she used to buy at the supermarket. And every Friday I make tea in the lounge. Too strong, just the way she always complained about. Sometimes she looks at the cup, then looks at me, and smiles. I don't know how long we have left, Neither does anyone. But I've stopped measuring our marriage by what Margaret remembers. Because I remember the girl I married, the woman who stood beside me for 41 years, the woman who knew every scar on my body, the woman who could tell when I was hurting before I said a word, and when her mind became a place she couldn't find her way around. I became the one who remembered the way home. I used to think putting Margaret in a care home meant I'd failed her. Now I understand something different. Sometimes loving someone means admitting you can't keep them safe alone, and sometimes the hardest promise to keep isn't. I'll never leave you. I'll make sure you're cared for even when I can't do it all myself. Margaret once forgot my name. She forgot our address. She forgot the house we'd lived in for 30 years. But somewhere inside that fading memory, she kept looking for me. And I'll spend the rest of my life making sure she never has to look too far.